For our program, please rise. Please silence your phones. Turn them off for the duration of the program. Please join me as we begin with the singing of the national anthem. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose bright stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watch were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? Please be seated.
Good evening. My name is Shmuel Levine, long-standing member of this congregation, and it is my honor, on behalf of the Boca Raton Synagogue, to welcome you to our annual commemoration of the Yom Hashoah Ve'Akvura, Holocaust Memorial Day. As a child of Holocaust survivors, I often reflect upon my parents' life experience as it relates to the Holocaust. I find myself these days focusing less on their time in the camps and more on the lives post-Holocaust, on their lives as survivors. It is this aspect of their lives that has more relevance and meaning to me and my children and grandchildren than is the time they spent in the camps. My parents, as did so many other Holocaust survivors, lived rich, productive lives infused with positive energy. My parents helped build a Jewish day school, were instrumental in founding a new synagogue that for 40 years my father was Rabbi of, and within their modest means were generous, both with their resources and their time. They had their moments, to be sure, but nobody outside our immediate family ever got to see any of that aspect of their lives. As I look back, their lives were a quiet inspiration, not only for our immediate family, but for many, many who lived in our community. As much as people thought they understood what my parents went through, myself included, no one can really appreciate the trauma they experienced. From time to time, as the eldest child, I was briefly able to get a glance into what they'd been through. One such opportunity comes to mind, the day we were going to become American citizens. This was a monumental day in my parents' lives. America was a blessing, and they believed themselves to be beyond fortunate at having arrived on these blessed shores. It was the early 1950s. My parents and I found ourselves in the chambers of a federal court judge. In those days, they didn't hold mass citizenship granting ceremonies that we have today. There was pretty much no ceremony at all, just an interview with the judge in chambers. The memory is strong, even from a young child's perspective, perhaps because of what followed. The judge, clothed in a flowing black robe that matched the somber expression on his face, sat behind a mammoth mahogany desk, at least it seemed mammoth to a young child, the American flag off to his right, and on the wall, observing the proceedings, was a picture of Dwight David Eisenhower. This was serious business. As I stood with my father to one side, my mother to the other side, me in the middle, the judge spoke. Looking at my father, he said, "It says here that you had a wife and a child before the war. Where are they?" My father tensed, looked to the floor, embarrassed, shuffling his feet. As for me, my ears perked up. This was news to me. What was the judge talking about? My father was married to my mother, and I was their only child. Certainly, my father would refute the allegation, but he didn't. My father said, "They are dead." The judge continued to press the issue. "How do you know they're dead?" I could sense my father's extreme discomfort. His wife and young son were witnessing this horribly awkward conversation. My father wasn't denying what the judge was saying. Incredibly, he actually was acknowledging it. My father answered that everyone who was taken away on that transport was murdered at Treblinka. The judge, in his ignorance and his gross insensitivity, continued, "How can you be sure that they are not alive?" My father said, "It's been 10 years, nobody survived." The judge exhaled, kind of an annoyed kind of breath. He said, "Oh well," and he signed the papers. 40 years later, my father passed away, and we asked my mother if she needed help with preparing the matzeva. She said no, she took care of it herself. Imagine the astonishment, my astonishment, my brother's astonishment. When we came to the cemetery, there was the headstone, and then there was a margin around it, also a stone, and then there was a foot demarcating the bottom of the grave. And on that was written Yehuda Tzvi ben Moshe Halevi. Yehuda Tzvi ben Moshe Halevi was my father's son who perished in the Holocaust. And my mother, in I believe a heroic and selfless act that was emblematic of how she lived her life, created one more act of selflessness by putting his name on my father's grave. We were always very proud of my mother, but never more proud than we were that day. My father lived with the wound of the lost family. My mother lived with the knowledge that her husband had loved another before he married her. Each lived with their sorrow. But you couldn't know this when you met them. They were positive, productive, cordial, outgoing, seemingly ordinary. But they were anything but ordinary. Their lived experience did not prevent them from actively building for the future of their family, the future of Klal Yisrael. The courage and resilience exhibited by my parents and their compatriots was Herculean. The sobriquet survivor is inadequate to describe what they went through. They were not some version of someone who walks away from a terrible car accident. They and all the survivors are and were the personification of the vision given to the Navi Yechezkel, the vision of the valley of dry bones that were resurrected and came back to life. The miracle was not their resurrection, both in the times of Yechezkel and also in modern times. Not that they were brought back to life. That's not the miracle. The miracle was that they lived. They lived in every sense of the word. They didn't get into a fetal position and give up on life. So their story and their heroine needs to be told and retold. As we observe this sacred day in the shadow of the worst disaster to befall the Jewish people since the Holocaust, as we watch the unfolding of Jew hatred around the world, we need to turn to their legacy for the strength to face this new, yet old adversity. We dare not be cowed. We dare not be intimidated. We are an eternal people. And if we ever, God forbid that, we need to look to the generation who survived the Holocaust for inspiration. It is for this reason that we meet here every year to make certain that their story remains alive, as each generation of Jews, unfortunately, b'chol dor v'dor, faces its particular generational challenge. At this time, this is probably the most painful aspect of our program. As I said, I've been in this show for 24 years. And as we observed this day 24 years ago, and we called on Holocaust survivors to come forward to light the candles here, there was a room full of people that got up and walked forward and lit the candles. And as we call on the Holocaust survivors in the room today, we are reminded of whom we have lost over the past number of decades. So at this time, I ask with reverence that if anyone in the room, and I don't know who you are, is a Holocaust survivor, be that a child survivor, a Holocaust survivor, whatever the definition is, please come forward and light one of the 6 candles in memory of the 6 million.
Yeah, right there. Just right.
This time I would like to ask children and grandchildren of survivors to come forward and light candles too. Please don't hesitate.
Anybody else leave? And to turn another person. Somebody need a candle. Anybody else come around? Go. Anybody else come around?
Hi. And I or little kid thing. Huh? Don't blow it out, no. But the heat's bottom, you stand it up. All right. You good? Did you like it? Keep watching. Fade didn't get a haircut.
A modicum of nechama, of solace, is achieved when we see a room of children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, people just from the community fill a room to come and honor the memory of the survivors and those who perished. At this time, it's my great honor to introduce Rabbi Efrem Goldberg, who really needs no introduction. I always say that a person is judged by the people he gets to introduce. And Rabbi Goldberg is, well, we all know what he is, Rabbi Goldberg.
I want to express my gratitude to Rabbi Levine for his leadership tonight. He should continue to inspire us for many, many years to come in good health. Like all of you, I can't help but feel this Yom Hashoah is so different. Different probably than any other in my lifetime. Ordinarily we get together, we gather Yom HaShoah, and we listen and we hear reflections and we see and admire and revere our survivors. And for me, since I'm a child throughout my life, it's been about an event of the past, a piece of history. That all those years ago, back in my grandparents', great-grandparents' time, the murdered victims for whom I named, my grandfather's brothers, Efrem and Chaim, there were enemies, there were people who hated us, there were people who wanted to destroy us. We mark and we celebrate such occasions, on Hanukkah and on Purim, and just now on Pesach, and we read and we sing, every generation they want to wipe us out. And then right after Pesach, Yom HaShoah comes as if to affirm, as if to remind us how true what we just sang was. And it wasn't only then, it's as recent as now, when we yet still have survivors who lived that atrocity. And we sing and we say slogans like never again. But we're blessed to live in a prosperous time, in a free time, in a time in which Jews are comfortable and safe and secure in our host countries around the world, and if not, in Israel. And yet this Yom HaShoah feels like different than every other. That we're not just commemorating a part and a piece of our past, but it's screaming out to us a message and a lesson about our present, As we are meeting tonight, soldiers have just engaged the long-awaited battle in Rafah. It's not lost on me, and I'm sure it isn't on you, how many people who came forward to light a candle. How extraordinary. How many survivors in second and third generation stepped up to light a candle, who lost their ancestors, but who currently have children or grandchildren who are serving in Israel's defense forces. A fundamental and radical difference from the very events that we're here to commemorate tonight. Battle in Rafah has begun, and the battles across college campuses are taking place. And the condition of the Jew in the world does not feel like it has felt throughout my lifetime. Yom HaShoah is a day designated about the past. feels like it's Tisha B'Av. Eicha yashva badad. How we are so alone, so misunderstood, so mistreated in this world. And so for me this year, Yom HaShoah has so many messages, many familiar, but some that are new. But the slogan of never again is not a slogan, and it's not a bumper sticker. It's not just something that we say, it's something that we have to mean. It's something that the world has to fight for and defend and stand up for. That never again is not just convenient for a post or a statement or a tweet or a PR move. Never again in policies, never again in funding, never again has to mean never again. For Jews around the world, in Israel, on campuses, in Congress, wherever we are. I was thinking, why do we observe Yom HaShoah? Simply to mark the horrific and tragic murder, the deaths of so many? Absolutely, it's worthy. But it's not unique. Maybe in magnitude, it's different than every other. But there are so many tragedies of our past. Our story, our history is riddled with tragedy. And if we designate a day for each, there would be no ordinary days left on our calendar of crusades and inquisition and pogroms and expulsions. So why do we have a Yom HaShoah? I was thinking about this today, and it struck me that it's not only about grieving and commemorating and honoring the Kedoshim, the 6 million who gave their lives. It is about extracting from their story and their loss and the perseverance and tenacity of the 7th million who survived and on whose shoulders we stand, to draw the lessons of the present, to understand the adversity that we face, to recognize that what it means to be a Jew in this world is a willingness to be who we are, to carry our identity, to stand for our mission, even in the face of those who want to destroy us and eliminate us. Even if it's not popular, and even if it's not appreciated, even if it doesn't win public opinion, and even if we are misunderstood, to not give up, to not walk away, to not abandon, but to stay true to who we are and what is our mission. Is that not what the 7th million Rabbi Levine spoke so beautifully about? Was describing that Yom HaShoah certainly at its core is about loss and tragedy, but it's also about survival and tenacity. It's about the heroic survivors in this room. So few in number, as Rabbi Levine mentioned, that breaks our heart, but still, when we admire and revere and learn from, we can't express adequately the appreciation we have for all that we have is only because of them. We may have been beaten, we may limp away, we may have suffered countless losses, but the survivors rebuilt, they carried on, they stood strong, they stood true. And that's why we have everything that we have. And as we face our adversity, and yet again our generation's confrontation with those who want to eliminate us, it's our hour and it's our moment to walk in their footsteps, to carry their DNA of survival, of tenacity, of resolve, of staying true with pride, and by practicing what it means to be a Jew, that we have a mission and a purpose. It is who we are. This magnificent new biography came out on Erev Pesach, literally, on the Kloisenberger Rebbe, the Shefa Chaim of Sons. Rabbi Yekosir Yehuda Halberstam, who lived from 1905 to 1994. The Kloisenberger Rebbe was married before the war with 11 children. His wife and all 11 children were murdered in Auschwitz. His story is extraordinary. He had every reason to cower and to assume that fetal position. He had every reason to retreat and recoil into himself. He built a dynasty in a world, in Union City, in New Jersey, in America. And then he understood where our future is. He grew up in Romania, Kloisenberg, a Hasidus that certainly couldn't be described as Zionist, but he understood the Jewish future, and he picked up and he took his Hasidus to Netanya, to Israel. He built a community. A Laniado hospital contributed enormously to the state of Israel. He practiced not only physical resistance, but maybe the paradigm of spiritual resistance during the Holocaust. The extraordinary stories of how he stayed true to what it meant to be a Jew, what it means to be a Jew, is an inspiration. The SS guards began taunting and teasing the Kloisenberger Rebbe. When he came to Auschwitz, they pulled at his beard and they pushed him around. The vile soldiers trained their guns on him. And the commander screamed out, "Tell us, Rabbi, you really still believe you're the chosen people? You think you're the chosen people?" The soldiers guarding the crowd howled in laughter, but the Rebbe did not. He answered loud and clear, "Most certainly we are." And when he did, the officer became even further enraged. He lifted his rifle above his head and he sent it crashing down on the head of the Kloisenberger Rebbe, and the Rebbe fell to the ground, one of the many, many, many beatings he would take throughout the war. And there was a rage in the officer's voice, and he screamed out, "You still think you're the chosen people?" And once again, now beaten and bruised and lying on the floor, the Rebbe nodded his head. And he said, "Yes, we are." The officer became infuriated. He kicked the Rebbe in the chin and he repeated, "You stupid Jew. You lie here on the ground, beaten, humiliated. You're lying in a pool of blood. What makes you think you're the chosen people?" And with his mouth gushing with blood, the Kloisenberger Rebbe looked up and he said, "As long as we are not the ones kicking and beating and murdering innocent people, we are still the chosen people." And you fast forward all these years, and we have today the most ethical and moral army in the history of the world, dropping leaflets and relocating 100,000 people in 3 hours because they have and will do more to protect innocent civilians than anyone has ever done. And as long as we have such an army, we are still the chosen people. And they can kill 4 of our soldiers just this week, 264 altogether, and 1,200 innocent people on October 7th. And as long as we are protecting innocent people, we are still the chosen people, the holy people of Hashem. Our parsha begins with the words Kedoshim Tihiyu, be holy. We call those who are martyred, who gave their lives, dying al Kiddush Hashem, the Kedoshim, to be holy. Kotzker Rebbe points out the last 2 words of our parsha, Demehem Bam. And the Kotzker Rebbe said, Kedoshim Tiyu are the opening 2 words, Demehem Bam are the last 2 words, because even if it costs your blood, our mission and our mandate is to always be Kadosh, to be Kedoshim, to strive for and to live for that holiness. So the lessons of Yom Hashoah ring out and are more true this year maybe than any other, at least in my lifetime, of never again to be ready and to understand this world does not love and embrace or treat the Jew fairly. Too many. To have our eyes open, to live with respect and love, but also a healthy dose of suspicion and knowledge and clarity. To have faith in tomorrow and to understand our responsibility to not only survive, but to thrive, to build, to persevere, to be tenacious, to never abandon our mission. And what is that mission? It's Kedoshim Tiyu Demehem Bam, to be a people of Kedusha. That if we merit to live al Kiddush Hashem, we draw inspiration and strength from those who died, who gave up their lives Al Kiddush Hashem, that our mission is now more important than ever to live with Jewish pride and to practice what it means to be a Jew and to stand up for one another and to do it together. The Kloisenberger Rebbe said he was taken from Auschwitz to Warsaw to clean up Warsaw. As the Nazis were losing the war, they were sent on a death march. And he said on that death march, they had no beards, they had no hair, they had nothing on their head. And when they walked arm in arm on that death march, if you looked to your right and to your left, you didn't see a chassid or a litvak, religious and non-religious. You couldn't tell anyone's background. You couldn't tell anyone's identity. You couldn't tell which minyan they davened in. All you saw was the holy soul locked arm in arm. They walked with a unity. That's the unity that we have to follow today. It's an honor and a privilege we have this evening to welcome a child survivor who was hidden, survived, and is telling his story since then. It's not easy. We're so grateful to you, Alex, for making yourself vulnerable and to revisit a part of your past, which is so unbearably painful, to do so to inspire us. Ask everyone to join me in welcoming and in honoring and thanking Alex Metzger for joining us tonight and sharing your story.
Thank you for inviting me here. It's indeed an honor. And I must say to you, I feel that I'm preaching to the choir. I look around and we've all heard the stories. We're all the same religion. And you've had other people talk about their backgrounds and we speak to each other about each other. I think we're missing the mark. We shouldn't be sitting here. We should be outside. You should go to churches and civic groups and HOAs and share your stories with them and not keep talking about ourselves to ourselves. And we need to get the word out and the message of what's been going on and what we could do to overcome what's going on today and not to repeat the history that we've suffered through. Let me begin with my background. My parents were born in Germany, and during the late 1920s and early 30s, when things were shaping up in Europe that there might be a war inevitably, they did what so many people did in Germany. They started moving west. They left Germany and settled in Brussels, Belgium. They had a home there and lived very securely in Belgium. On May 10th, 1940, Nazi Germany invaded Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. My father was picked up on the streets that day, never to be seen again. My mother was pregnant and decided she wanted to leave Belgium and try to make her way to Great Britain. Great Britain said anybody in the mainland Europe that wants to come here, as things don't look good in Europe, you're welcome here and we will protect you. She tried to get from Brussels and approximately 50 miles to the English Channel to cross over to Great Britain. She got as far as a town called Bruges. Some of you may be familiar with Bruges. My mother went into labor because I decided I wanted to see the world. She didn't know what to do, but she saw a convent. She went into the convent and explained to them that she's in labor and she's about to give birth. Could they help her? And that's where I was born. Thereafter, she left Bruges and decided to go back to her home in Brussels. I was approximately 2 weeks old. The truth be told, I don't remember. I don't think you remember what you were doing when you were 2 weeks old. But this is what I was told. My mother was walking on the street with me, and apparently I was crying. A strange woman came up to her and asked her, "Why is your baby crying?" And my mother said, "Well, he's a newborn, and I have no money to buy food to feed him." She said to her, "Can I ask you a question?" My mother said, "Sure." She said, "Are you Jewish?" My mother said, "I am." She said, "Give me your baby. I live around the corner, and you can come visit anytime you want." Marie Harrison's picked me up and took her to her home. And Marie Hairsons was married to Joseph Hairsons. And in those days, when people gave birth, very few people knew other people knew they were pregnant. All of a sudden, they'd come home with a newborn. And there I was, and everybody assumed I was Marie and Joseph's son. And they didn't have gender identification parties as we have today. However, that's how I wound up with Marie and Joseph Hairsons. It turns out Marie and Joseph Hairsons were devout Catholics. As such, they raised me up as a Catholic, went to church every single Sunday, would not miss a Christmas Eve service, and they raised me as their only son. My mother used to come to visit, and they told me that was my Aunt Rose. I didn't know any different, and it wasn't until the end of the war that I found out I got hit with a double whammy. Number one, the woman who comes to visit your Aunt Rose is really your Mother Rose. And number two, you're not Catholic, you're Jewish. At this point in time, I was about 6 years old, and you want to talk about your mind exploding. What do you believe now? All of a sudden, you find out it's a different religion, different parents. I was not a happy camper. At that point in time, my mother had remarried, and she came back to reclaim me in 1947. My stepfather, who was serving in the military, was transferred from Belgium and restationed in London. Therefore, my mother finally got to Great Britain, and I, of course, went along with them. At this point in time, of course, I had to learn a new language. French was the only language I knew, a new religion, a new name. My name was Alex Hairsons, not Metzger. I had to learn new customs, new religion, a new way of life, and talk about your formative years. Boy, it was not the easiest thing in the world. However, we did go to London and stay there until about 1949, when we immigrated to the United States. My father had written letters. I don't know how many people know, but the Red Cross acted as a mail carrier, and they delivered letters to people being held in work camps and concentration camps and took mail out. As such, my father had written to my mother. He knew I was born. He knew what my name was. And I have to have a copy of all those letters with me here. If anybody wants to see them later, I'll be happy to share them with you. A quick note about them. I got them when in the late 1960s, Alex Haley wrote a book called Roots. And I got very engrossed in that book, and that turned out to be a TV series called Roots, and I got hooked. And all of a sudden it dawned on me, here I am, you know, by now I'm in my late 30s, don't know anything about my roots, and I want to find out about my roots. In 1983, my wife and I decided to trace my roots to Belgium. And we had dinner at my mother's house a few weeks before we were leaving, and my mother happened to ask me, what are you doing for vacation this year? So I said, we're doing something very unique and different. She said, what's that? I said, we're going to Belgium to trace my roots. And she said, why are you doing that? And the fact is, I told her very honestly, because you didn't tell me enough about myself. I don't know much where I come from and my family, and I'm going to find them on my own. And as things turned out, my mother very rarely spoke about the war, and which was not unusual. However, my wife and I did go. Before we went, I did something interesting. By now I was in New York. I was a student. I had gone to school, elementary school, high school, and college in New York City. And after college, I was in the Army during the Vietnam crisis, although I was always stationed here in the States, did not go to Vietnam. Before we went in 1983, I went to Grand Central Station. I don't know how many of you people are from New York here, but Grand Central Station had a claim to fame. It had the most telephone directories in the world at one location. And that's where the AT&T was. I went there, I asked them to give me a book about Belgium. And they sit me in a little cubicle. I looked up Brussels, and I found the name Hairsons. Without looking around, I took a pocket knife, and this was the result. I closed the directory. Thank you very much. If anyone's still looking for this page, I have it. anyhow, I took this with me when we went to retrace my roots. I decided to go to the American Embassy. After all, I was an American citizen. I was a veteran by now. And I went to the embassy and I told them I need someone to make some phone calls for me. And it's something interesting I need to point out in this telephone directory. The way they set up the directory, they put the person's last name. They don't give a first name. They give a last name, the address, and phone number. And I see all these Harrisons, so I didn't know Joseph Marie Harrison. And by now, the address didn't help me because they could have moved. It was 1983. The war ended in 1945. They put me in touch with a young lady at the embassy, and I asked her if she could speak English, French, and Flemish. English and French, you all know what that is. Flemish is a language that's spoken in northern Belgium. It's a bastardized version of French, Dutch, and German. And I said, do me a favor, call up everybody Harrison's, but don't start at the top of the page, start at the bottom and work your way up. She made the first phone call, and she starts speaking to this woman in French. And remember, by now I'd forgotten all my French, and she shook her head no to me. She made the next phone call, starts talking, she gives me a thumbs up. And she said, this woman wants to know who's looking for Joseph Marie Harrison's. I said, who should I tell her he's here? So I said, tell him it's Alex Harrison's. And this woman said to her, where can I see him? I'd like to meet him. So she asked, where do you live? And she was told that we're at the American Embassy in downtown Brussels. And she said, I'm 20 minutes away. And we went to visit Denise Harrison's. Denise Harrison's apparently was a contemporary of mine. As a matter of fact, she remembered me. She claimed that we used to play together as playmates. But quite frankly, I don't recall, because by the time I left, I was 6 or 7 years old. I don't know how many of you know who your playmates were when you're 4, 5, 6 years old. The only playmate I remember is the Harrisons had a dog, had a big collie, and that was my best friend. And today I'm still a big dog lover. However, Denise told me that Francois had a brother. Joseph had a brother called Francois, who's still alive and who was living in Brussels. And she said, where are you staying? I told her the name of the hotel. So she said, you're within walking distance of that hotel. However, by the end of that day, I didn't want to go visit Francois. The next day, we hired a driver, and I had some addresses. I had the address of my parents' home, and I had the address of where the Harrisons lived. And I had him take me to the Harrisons' house. I told my wife to stay in the car, and I'm only going to take some pictures. And one of the most amazing things that ever happened. The driver got out of the car and was standing there as I was taking pictures of this apartment building. And this elderly woman, had to be in her 90s, if not older, could barely walk with a cane and a dog, and she starts speaking to the driver in French. And I'm wondering what they're speaking about. The driver says to me, she wants to know why you're taking pictures here. So I said, tell her I used to live in this building at that second floor where the green awning is. She looks at me, says, are you Alex? I said, how do you know? She said, you're supposed to be dead. I said, I'm not dead, I'm here. I said, how do you know my name? She said, if you live there, then you must be Joseph Marie's son. They were my very best friends. I know they lost their son after the war. So anyhow, that was quite a rude awakening. And let me tell you, if someone 40 years later tells you your name, from that point on, I told the driver, if you drive up the street, it bends to the right, and it opens up into a big square. And on the left-hand side of the square is a big staircase, and there's a church. And if you go up to that church, that's where I used to go every Sunday. And he said, are you sure? I said, absolutely, I'm sure. It's amazing what your mind could do to you 40 or 50 years later. And I said, do me a favor, take my wife, drive very slowly, I'm walking. And sure enough, everything opened up. There's a square, there's a staircase, and there's the church. We went into the church and we sat down in the last row. And a rector came up to us and wanted to know what we're doing there. And the driver said to him, this young man used to be a parishioner here. He said, you were? I said, what's your name? I said, Alex Harrison's. He said, are you Joseph Marie's son? So obviously they were very well known. As I said, they were devout Catholic. They would not miss a service or a midnight mass. To this day, I still watch the midnight mass every year on TV. And we went to visit Francois. I happen to have one picture, the only one I have of myself with Joseph Marie Harrison's. You probably can't see this from where you're sitting, but let me share with you what happened. We rang the bell, and on the second floor, a gentleman rolled up a window, and he had long, white, straggly hair. And my wife, who fortunately speaks French, said, "Are you Francois Harrison?" She said, "Yes, I am." She said, "Would you mind coming down here? We'd like to speak with you." He came down, and he asked, "Who are you? What do you want to know?" So I showed him this picture. I said, "Do you know anyone in this picture?" He points out to this gentleman. He said, "That's my brother Joseph, and that's his wife, Marie." He said, "I don't know who that is." That obviously was me, about 3 or 4 years old. So I said, "That's me, that's Alex." He said, "No, you're not Alex, you're dead." So in 2 days now, people try to convince the guy who's dead. I didn't know what to say or do, but during our conversation, I said to my wife, "Do me a favor, ask Francois what happened to his flaming red hair." She asked him, and he said, "If you remember me as a redhead, then you're Alex." And that was a fascinating trip. I did gain a lot. I found out that I had a brother who passed away before the war, unrelated to the war. He was a victim of pneumonia before he had modern medicine, and unfortunately passed away in the late 30s. And I found that out based on these letters that my father had written. My brother's name was David. And in his letters, when he found out I was born, he asked in one of the letters, he asked my mother, "Are you satisfied with David's replacement?" And obviously I was David's replacement, and they did communicate back and forth. These letters that I'm referring to, before we went in 1983, my mother, when she asked me what you're doing for a vacation this year, when we were leaving the house, she said, "Hold on, I want to give you something." And she gave me a box, not very big, about 8.5 by 11. And she said, "Open this when you get home." Of course, I opened it as soon as I got to my car downstairs, and there were 12 letters in there. Unfortunately, I could not read the letters because they were all written in the old European, very fancy penmanship, either in French or in German. And I had no way of making out heads or tails of it. I was very active in our temple in New Jersey, where we were living at this time. I was on the board of directors, and the rabbi knew my story. He was one of the very few people in the world that knew, but I never spoke about my background. As far as people knew, I was born in Belgium, and that's all I ever said. I asked the rabbi if anybody in the congregation could translate these letters for me. He said, "Yes, I'll give them to Mrs. Goldstein. You know who she is." He called me a few days later and said, "I have your letters for you," but she couldn't translate them. I said, "Why not?" She said, "They're too heart-gripping and too emotional." She couldn't do it. So then it dawned on me. I got home, and a few days later, I recalled my brother-in-law is a professor at Columbia University. I called my brother-in-law, Bruce. I asked him to come over to the house. I need to speak to him. I had these letters. I told him he knew I was born in Belgium, but he had no idea about my background, that I was raised by a Catholic family. I gave him a quick 10-minute overview. And I said, "Can you give these letters to anybody who teaches the Romance languages and the European languages to get them translated for me? One condition, I'm not to be identified." He said, "Why not?" I said, "I don't want to watch the 11 o'clock news one night and see a human interest story and I'm the star." So he said, "Look, I'll handle it for you." He called me back about 2 weeks later and said, "I have your letters for you." So he said, "It's very interesting. Professor so-and-so," unfortunately I've forgotten his name by now, was teaching a graduate course in these Romance languages. He held up these letters and he told the graduate students, "If anybody translates these letters, you will not have to write a thesis, and I'll give you your graduate degree." So talk about a double winner. I got my letters, and someone got their graduate degree. The original letters I've donated to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and I have the copies of all of them in this book that I have, if anybody wants to see them later with the translations. So that's basically A quick background about my well-being. Meanwhile, my son wound up going to Israel to medical school. And he called me up one day after he was in Israel for several months. And he said, Dad, I have to ask you a question. I said, sure. How come I don't see your name or the Harrison's name anywhere at Yad Vashem? I said, why should you? He said, why shouldn't I? He said, why didn't you get them into Yad Vashem? I said, I don't know how to do it. He said, that's nonsense. You're going to do it or else I'll never speak to you again. And he said, I'll find out. I'll send you the paperwork. He sent me a stack of paperwork that I really did not appreciate getting, but I went ahead and did what I had to do. It took me a long time to get the Harrisons into Yad Vashem. And when I finally did get them in, my wife and I went to the induction ceremony. This is the actual medal that Yad Vashem gives people who saves anyone. Since they weren't there, they gave it to me, and this is the actual medal, and I also have a certificate. Along with that, I have a picture. I have a very close friend who's a doctor in New York. He's still there to this day, and he's at Mount Sinai Hospital, if you're familiar with New York City. My friend Lynn, who knew my story, he always wanted me to get in touch with someone and write a book about my background. He's a very strong Zionist, and I refused to do it. He called me up one day a couple of years ago. I'm sitting here at home in Florida, the phone rings, and he said, how you doing? This is Lynn. I said, Lynn, what's going on? Where are you? He said, you'll never guess where I'm calling you from. I said, yes, I will. You're either at Mount Sinai Hospital, you're at home. He said, no, I'm 7,000 miles away. I said, you are? He said, I'm going to take a picture. I'm going to email it to you. He took a picture of Yad Vashem where the Harrison's name is engraved in stone, honoring them in the righteous nations. And of course, Lynn remembered my background. He remembered my name. And that's how we got them into Yad Vashem. Since then, I've done a lot of research about finding information. Several years ago, I was reading a paper, Palm Beach Post. Many of you probably get it. And there's an article called Nazi Archives Yield Hidden Stories of Holocaust. And this is a story about Bad Araslan. I don't know how many people are familiar with it. Bad Araslan is a location in Germany. And they are an archive. And what they have there is when the Germans picked up people, they interrogated them. They asked them about their families, how many brothers and sisters, nephews, cousins, parents, and they recorded all this information. From the 6 million people, they have 17 million pieces of information. I didn't know if this was possible. I didn't think it was true. I went on the computer and I punched in Bad Araslan, and there was a questionnaire. Why are you on this page? I said, I'm trying to find out information about my family. They said, who are you? I said, why do you want to know? We don't divulge this to anybody, only certain people. You have to be a family member. So they said, give us your name and wait on your computer screen. Give us a few minutes. 30 seconds later, I got a message. Are you Alex Metzger, born in Bruges, Belgium, June 1940? And I said, yes. When they came back with that information so instantaneous, I knew it wasn't a scam and they were legitimate. I put in my father's name, and they came up with all sorts of information. For example, I now found out his date of birth, and I found out where he was born, and I found out his parents' name, obviously my grandparents. And from there, I went on and got more information. One of the greatest sources for getting information, again, the Red Cross comes to bat. The Red Cross has a tracing service in Baltimore, Maryland. Before my wife and I moved down here to Florida, we're here about 18 years now. I've been in touch with the Red Cross service in Baltimore, the tracing service. I asked them if they could help me find background about my family. They wrote me back a very nice letter. We're sorry to hear about your loss. We'll do the best we can. Normally it takes us 2 to 3 weeks. Sometimes it takes us 2 to 3 months. Occasionally it could take us a few years. I was living in Florida and I got a phone call one afternoon. And a young lady says to me, my name is such and such. I'm calling from the Red Cross. I said, what do you want? She said, I'm with the tracing service. The fact of the matter is, I forgot what the tracing service was all about. It was several years later. I said, what's the tracing service? They said, are you Alex Metzger? Yes. Is your father Ludwig Metzger? I said, yes. She said, we have a whole stack of information here for you. We'd like to send it to you. I said, where are you located? She said, I'm in Florida, West Palm Beach. I said, don't mail it to me. Just give me the street address. And she came up with all of these pages, well, hundreds of pages of information that the Red Cross Tracing Service had found. I believe they're still active, and if anybody's interested in finding out about their family, I would highly recommend contacting the Red Cross Tracing Service in Baltimore. If anybody wants their contact information, I'll share it with you, the phone number and their webpage. The other things I found out through my research, you know, when you see pictures of people being put on cattle cars going to various camps, the Germans, and we all know they were anal, they kept all sorts of records unbeknownst to us. I came up with this document. I don't know how many can read. Let me read this to you. It says, transport on September 11th, 1942, from Drancy to Auschwitz. Drancy is a work camp in France with 1,026 names in it. I went through all the names, and there's my father's name with his date of birth. Now, can you imagine what they could have done if they had cell phones and iPads? This was all done by hand. My theory is that the underlings who were keeping these records were doing this to show their superiors they're doing a good job in hopes of being promoted. No one's ever disputed that, unless someone else has an idea why they would keep these records. It's beyond me. When we came to the United States, obviously, as I said, I went to school here. And after the closing of the war, I vividly remember, as I'm speaking to you now, it still comes to my mind, everybody was celebrating on the streets in Brussels. And Joseph Marie took me downstairs, and everybody was in a good mood and happy and joyful. And a big building was on fire. I remember asking, why is that building on fire? And they said, that's where the German headquarters was. We want nothing to do with them. We got rid of them, and we're going to keep getting rid of them. Soldiers were going down the streets handing out cigarettes and chocolate. I was too young to smoke, so I took the chocolate. When we came to the United States, my father had written a letter to my mother saying that his sister lives in New York City, and he put down her street address and where she lives in Manhattan. And it's interesting, in the original letter, you see a swastika. Obviously, these letters were censored before the Red Cross picked up. And that's why sometimes you'll see a movie and you'll see where they were going in the United States and finding people related. Because they had this information, they put it to use. When we got to the United States, I had two problems, among others, other than religion and language and customs. They lived in a top floor in a building, and in New York, there's a George Washington Bridge, a very prominent bridge in New York, which has two lights up on top, two beams, a red light and a white light that circulates at night. And those lights used to shine into the bedroom where I was sleeping. Whenever that red light came into the room, I had to duck under the covers. I just couldn't stand watching a red light. I assume it's had something to do with during the war years, seeing red lights. The other thing that bothered me, if I was walking on the streets in New York and an emergency vehicle, an ambulance, a fire truck, or a police car with a siren going off, I used to duck into the first doorway. Obviously, I overcame that. We spoke to my parents took me to some doctors. He said he'll outgrow it. Of course I did. For a while, I worked with the Sheriff's Department here in Palm Beach, and I learned how to use the sirens and not be afraid of them anymore. But that's basically my background, and I'd be happy to try to answer some questions if anybody has any. If not, I thank you for the opportunity.
Please rise for the Keil, Molei, and Hatikvah.
Molei Rachamim Shafein Bamramim Amtzei Menucha Nechana Kanfei Ashkina B'ma'alos Kedoshim Utorim Kizohar Harakia Masirim Eskal Neshama Shoshishes Milyonei HaYehudim Chalei Hashoah be'Europa shenispu hakidush Hashem b'idei hamaratzlim haGermanim v'ozreihem mishar ha'amim lachein ba'al harachamim yasdirem b'seiser k'nafav li'olamim v'yitzror b'tzror ha'chayim es nishmoseihem Adonai hu nachal asam b'gan Eden tehem menuchasam V'yamdu l'gar alam l'kei tzayamin v'namar amen. Kol ha'aleva v'nima nefesh Yehudi yamina u'l'chazeh mizrach kadima Ayin Metzger Hatikvah b'shnot habayim li'atan choshi be'yaseh Thank you all for joining us. There is a mincha starting now in the social hall. Right now it's 7:40. Marav will be in about 15 minutes in the social hall as well.